Hello there, Sam Visnic here from EndYourBackPainNow.com, and today I'm going to be talking about the topic of anterior pelvic tilt. Now, I know that this is a buzzword going on in the industry right now and around the world when it comes to back pain, and it's a very highly relevant topic. So first of all, the question is, what is anterior pelvic tilt? Well, the pelvis, if you don't know what it is this bowl-like structure that sits at the bottom of the spine. And this pelvic structure can actually be in a number of different distorted positions. So, for example, the pelvis can actually tilt forward or tilt backward, and if you look at the pelvis from the front here, the pelvis can actually be hiked on one side relative to the other side, or any combination of one side being tilted more than the other, and so forth. Now, this can get a little complicated, so what I'm going to do is just limit this video just to talking about one of these distortions, which is the most common, and it's called an excess anterior pelvic tilt. Now, I do say excess because anterior pelvic tilt is in fact completely normal, and for males normally the amount of anterior pelvic tilt is approximately 4 to 7 degrees, and females can be 7 to 10 degrees. So it's normal to have an anterior pelvic tilt, and what we're talking about in particular here is an excessive one, meaning have much more than that. Now, this position is most frequently correlated with back pain because when the pelvis tilts, as you see what I just did right there, in an anterior direction, so if you were standing facing that way, that when you tilt your pelvis forward, as if the pelvis were, for example, a bucket of water, and you're pouring water out the front onto your toes, when that pelvis tilts forward anteriorly, there's an immediate change in the position of the lumbar spine. So the position of the pelvis has very much is closely related to the position of the lumbar spine and what it's doing. So it's important to note during postural assessments how much curve an individual has, because it tells us essentially what all of the muscles are doing around the spine and around the pelvis. So if the pelvis is in an anterior pelvic tilt and it's stuck that way in a position that's much greater than the normal numbers or values, then we know that the lumbar spine has too much arch in it. So when the lumbar spine has too much arch in it, essentially there's going to be a crowding going on in the lumbar spine on the back side. So what that means is that when the spine is extended, essentially when it gets to the end of the range of motion, then the facet joints, these little joints between these vertebrae, become closed. So when the spine is stuck in extension because of an excessive anterior pelvic tilt, it puts a lot of pressure on those facet joints. In addition, the muscles that also assist in extending the spine, these spinal erector muscles, are going to become overworked. They're probably going to develop trigger points and a lack of blood flow, commonly known as ischemia. And these are factors that can actually promote pain. So, one of the causes that I've found is an excess anterior pelvic tilt to lead to back pain, or at least the very least, by reducing anterior pelvic tilt, there's more than often than not a significant reduction in pain in the lower back. So the question is, now, which things contribute to an excess anterior pelvic tilt? Well, there are a number of things, but to make them simple, let's just look at the muscles that can actually pull the pelvis into this direction. So, as I just mentioned, one of them is going to be the lumbar muscles. The lower back muscles, when they're overworked and they're short and tight, they create an extension in the spine, and that allows the pelvis to tip forward. Another thing that can do that is this big, powerful muscle on the front of the spine called the psoas muscle, and it attaches to all 5 lumbar vertebrae and then comes down and attaches on the inside of the thigh bone, called the femur. Now, that muscle is very strong and powerful, and there's a lot of debate on this from some therapists on whether or not it can pull the spine into extension or whether it actually pulls the pelvis up. In my experience, I have found that most individuals with an excess anterior pelvic tilt, regardless, benefit from making sure that this psoas muscle has normal length in it. So stretching the psoas is very important for restoring normal function to the lumbar spine, especially with an anterior pelvic tilt. So because of its attachment and because it's such a very important muscle, it needs to be stretched. The same thing with the lumbar erectors, they need to be stretched and or have therapeutic approaches such as massage therapy applied to it. So those two muscles are very important for pulling the pelvis into an anterior pelvic tilt. A third one is a member of the quadricep muscles, which are the muscles on the front of the thigh, and they attach on this bone down here in the front. And one in particular quadricep muscle called the rectus femoris is a muscle that assists with flexing the hip, which is bringing the leg up, which is essentially what the psoas does. So those two muscles can pull down on the front side of the pelvis via its ability to flex the hip and pull the spine into an excessive anterior pelvic tilt. So those muscles will need to be released, whether that's massage therapy and or stretching or other techniques. Now the muscles that are too weak in this situation are the reciprocal muscles from the ones that are too tight. So first of all is the abdominal muscles, and all of the abdominal muscles attach down here low on the pubic symphysis, and their job is to pull the pelvis up into the opposite direction of anterior pelvic tilt, called a posterior pelvic tilt. So those muscles will need to be activated and strengthened. Now, additionally, other muscles that will need to be strengthened is all the muscles on the back side below the lumbar spine. It's very common to have weakness in the gluteal muscles, especially the glute maximus, which is the largest glute muscle. So the glute maximus is a hip extensor, but it also will contribute to posterior pelvic tilt, and it's a direct opposition of the psoas muscle. In addition, with the glutes is going to be the hamstrings. The hamstrings assist with extending the hip, but they also assist with, of course, bending the knee. So those muscles tend to be overactivated, and while the glutes tend to lie kind of relaxed for the most part when there's an excess anterior pelvic tilt. So essentially what the hamstrings usually are weak for most people will need to be relaxed by getting the glutes to activate again and getting them to work properly with the hamstrings. So when the tension is balanced between those two muscles, the abdominal muscles are activated along with releasing the tension in the hip flexors and the lumbar extensors, then the pelvis normally will be allowed to rock backward. Now, while I'm bringing this up, the muscular elements, it's also important to note that not all of the reasons why a muscle would be overactivated can be purely from the muscle needing to be stretched. That doesn't always occur. Some of these muscles can be what we call facilitated, meaning that the nervous system is pouring input into them, increasing the tension, but technically they're not tight. So what can do that? Well, muscles are very responsive, of course, to the mother of them, which is going to be the central nervous system. And the central nervous system, whenever there's excess excitation in it, will pour that input into certain muscles in the body. And that's another topic altogether. But the psoas will be one of them. The rectus femoris will be another, for example, and even the lumbar erectors. So anything that causes excess problems with the central nervous system and thus resulting in a stress response can increase tension in some of these muscle groups. So this is another potential cause for excess anterior pelvic tilt. Outside of that, there are some additional factors that may need to be addressed to get your anterior pelvic tilt correction to stick. And another one is going to be having flat feet. So when you stand, you have no arch in your foot whatsoever, and it's not corrected when you do your pelvic tilting, meaning you actually do have a flat foot even when you're not standing on it. Then you may need to do some correction work in the lower extremity to support your correction efforts. Otherwise, you can fix all the imbalances just around the pelvis and get great back pain relief, but you may not be able to get the correction to hold if you're not correcting the lower extremity at the foot level. The other thing that can cause problems, of course, is things that are going up the chain, for example, the head and the neck. It's very well known that there's a strong correlation between forward head posture, the head going forward of where it's supposed to be, and the position of the pelvis. It's a little bit complicated why that happens. It has to do with reflexes and our bodies trying to right themselves, but issues up there and higher up in the what we call kinetic chain can cause problems with the pelvis. However, with all of that stated, what makes the most sense is to start with the corrections of the pelvis. Stretch the muscles that are too tight, strengthen the muscles that need to be activated and or maybe too weak, and then see what you get from there. Most people will achieve back pain relief quite simply by doing some basic things for correcting pelvic tilt and seeing if they're not sticking, for example, then you've got to work your way up and work your way down from the pelvis. So this is Sam Visnic. I hope you've enjoyed this short video. Be sure to check out my website, endyourbackpainnow.com, and I'll see you next time. To get a copy of my free report, The 3 Essentials to Getting Back Pain Relief, go to endyourbackpainnow.com/blog.